Living on a secluded farm has its perks: peace, quiet, and a sense of safety far removed from the chaos of the city. My wife, 2 kids, and I had spent years cultivating our land, making it a home. But last autumn, something changed. It started subtly, small items missing from the barn, like tools and sacks of feed. At first, we thought it was the work of animals or even the kids misplacing things. But as the nights grew colder, the disturbances became harder to ignore. One morning, as the sun rose over the cornfields, I found something that made my stomach turn. Human footprints, large and distinct, crisscrossing the dew-soaked ground. They weren't near the house but deep in the field, weaving between the tall stalks. I called my wife over, and we stood there, staring at the tracks. They were fresh, whoever had made them had been there just hours before. "It's probably just a passerby," I told her, more to calm myself than her. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The following night, I decided to stay up and keep watch. Armed with a flashlight and my old rifle, I waited near the barn, hidden behind some hay bales. The night was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears strain for the faintest sound. Around midnight, I heard it, a rustling in the cornfield. My heart pounded as I crept closer. The beam of my flashlight sliced through the darkness, but all I could see were the swaying stalks. Whoever was out there was good at staying hidden. The next day, my oldest son found something chilling near the edge of the field, a makeshift campsite. There was a small fire pit, now cold, surrounded by scraps of food and an old, torn jacket. Most unsettling of all was a knife sticking out of the dirt, its blade stained dark. We called the sheriff, who came out to investigate but found nothing conclusive. "Could be a drifter," he said, shrugging it off. "Just keep your doors locked." His words didn't ease our minds. If anything, they made the fear more tangible. That night, the intruder became bolder. Around 2 a.m., the barn door slammed shut with a force that woke the entire house. I grabbed my rifle and bolted outside, my wife calling after me to be careful. The footprints in the dirt were fresh and led directly into the cornfield. Summoning every ounce of courage, I followed them. The stalks towered over me, their rustling amplified in the dark. Then I saw him, a shadowy figure darting through the rows. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. He didn't stop. Instead, he moved deeper into the cornfield, his pace quickening. I gave chase, adrenaline overriding my instincts. But then I lost him. The maze of corn became disorienting, and the only sounds were my own ragged breaths and the pounding of my heart. Suddenly, I heard a voice, low, threatening, and far too close. "You should have stayed in the house." I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my hand, but the rows were empty. He was toying with me. I managed to find my way back to the house, shaken but unharmed. The sheriff returned the next day with a search team, and what they uncovered was far worse than we could have imagined. Hidden deep in the field was a stash of stolen goods, weapons, and disturbing items that suggested the man had been watching us for weeks. They eventually caught him in a neighboring county, a dangerous fugitive wanted for multiple violent crimes. The thought of him being so close to my family for so long still makes my skin crawl. Since that night, the farm hasn't felt the same. The cornfield, once a place of pride and hard work, now feels like a labyrinth of shadows. Every rustle in the wind reminds me of that figure slipping through the rows, and every night, I double-check the locks, haunted by the thought that danger can hide in the most familiar places. Living on a farm means you get used to long days and early mornings. During harvest season, the work becomes relentless, but there's a certain satisfaction in seeing the fruits of your labor. Our scarecrow stood tall at the edge of the field, a simple figure dressed in old clothes with a burlap sack for a face. It wasn't fancy, but it had been there for years, silently watching over the crops. That's why I immediately noticed when something seemed off. One morning, as I walked the rows of corn, I noticed the scarecrow was turned slightly, as if facing a different direction. At first, I thought it was the wind, though it was odd considering it hadn't been particularly breezy the night before. I adjusted it back to its original position and went on with my day. But the next morning, it was turned again, this time, further. It was subtle, but enough to feel unsettling. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe I hadn't placed it back as straight as I thought. But the feeling nagged at me. The third morning was when I knew something was wrong. The scarecrow wasn't just turned, it had moved several feet from where I'd placed it. My stomach dropped as I stared at it. This wasn't something the wind could do. Someone had to be moving it. I checked the ground for footprints but found nothing, just the packed dirt of the field. That night, I decided to stay up and keep watch. Armed with my shotgun, I sat by the window overlooking the field, the scarecrow barely visible in the moonlight. Hours passed, and I started to doubt myself. Maybe I was being paranoid. But around 2 a.m., I saw movement. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling the corn. But then I saw it, the scarecrow shifting, its silhouette moving unnaturally. My heart pounded as I grabbed the shotgun and headed outside, the cold air biting against my skin. The field was eerily quiet, and as I approached, I realized the scarecrow wasn't in its usual spot. It was several rows deeper into the field. "Who's out there?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the darkness. There was no response, but I felt eyes on me, like I was being watched. Slowly, I crept toward the scarecrow, my flashlight trembling in my hand. When I got closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The burlap sack that served as the scarecrow's head had been removed, and in its place was a hood, the kind someone might wear to stay hidden. Then I saw it, a figure crouched in the shadows just beyond the scarecrow. Before I could react, the figure bolted, disappearing into the corn. I fired a warning shot into the air, but the intruder was gone. When the police arrived the next day, they searched the property and found evidence that someone had been living in the field. A small stash of food wrappers, a sleeping bag, and even binoculars were hidden near the scarecrow's original position. Whoever it was, they had been watching us for days, maybe even weeks. The officers speculated that it was likely a drifter or someone trying to steal crops, but I wasn't convinced. Something about the way they used the scarecrow to stay hidden, to blend in, felt calculated, almost predatory. We replaced the scarecrow, but every time I walk the fields, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. I double-check the locks on the house every night now, and I keep the shotgun closer than ever. Because sometimes, the scariest things aren't the ones you can see, they're the ones hiding in plain sight. Life on a farm is hard work, but there's a rhythm to it, a routine that keeps everything running smoothly. That's why, when I started finding some of my cattle mutilated, it completely upended my world. At first, I thought it might be a wild animal. The carcasses had deep cuts, and the parts that were missing didn't make sense. Predators take what they need to survive, but this was different. It was methodical, almost surgical. What made it worse was that it kept happening. Week after week, another cow, another gruesome scene. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to install cameras around the property. I didn't tell anyone, not even my wife. Something about it felt wrong, like talking about it would make it worse. I spent an entire day setting up the cameras, making sure they covered the pastures and the barn. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed up, staring at the monitors in my office, waiting for something to happen. Around 2 a.m., the motion sensor went off. My heart raced as I switched to the live feed. At first, I didn't see anything. The cattle were restless, moving in tight clusters. Then, I saw them, figures emerging from the edge of the forest. There were 3 of them, dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by masks. They moved silently, almost like shadows, weaving through the herd. One of them carried a long, curved blade that glinted in the moonlight. I watched in horror as they approached one of my cows, their movements deliberate and ritualistic. They weren't just killing, they were performing something macabre. One of them knelt next to the cow, carving symbols into its hide while the others stood in a circle, chanting something I couldn't hear. The scene was surreal, like something out of a nightmare. I grabbed my shotgun and bolted out the door, my anger overriding my fear. When I reached the pasture, the air was thick with the smell of blood. The figures were gone, but the cow was there, lifeless, marked with symbols I didn't recognize. The next morning, I showed the footage to the sheriff. He looked pale as he watched, his hands gripping the desk tightly. "This isn't just theft," he muttered. "This is something much darker." He promised to investigate, but I could tell he didn't have much hope. Over the next few nights, I stayed on high alert, keeping watch over the farm. But no matter how long I waited, they didn't return, at least, not while I was awake. Then, one morning, I found something new, a circle of stones arranged near the edge of the forest, each one marked with the same symbols carved into the cows. In the center of the circle was a bundle of sticks, tied together with what looked like sinew. It was a warning, I realized, a message that they could come back whenever they wanted. I burned the bundle and knocked down the stones, but it didn't make me feel any safer. The sheriff's investigation didn't lead anywhere. "Probably just some sick kids," he said, but we both knew that wasn't the truth. Whoever they were organized, deliberate, and dangerous. Since then, I've fortified the farm, installed more cameras, and even set traps near the forest's edge. But the unease never left. At night, I still hear whispers coming from the woods, soft and distant, like the echoes of a chant. I've thought about selling the farm, leaving all this behind, but I can't. This land has been in my family for generations. I just hope that one day, whatever evil hides in those woods will stay there. But deep down, I know they're watching, waiting for the right moment to return. Our farm had a few forgotten corners, but the abandoned lot on the far edge of the property was the most neglected. Overgrown with weeds and tangled bushes, it had been left untouched for decades. That weekend, my family and I decided to clear it out, hoping to make use of the land. Armed with tools and gloves, we worked our way through the thicket, cutting and hauling brush. That's when my son called out, "Dad, there's something back here." His voice had a mix of excitement and unease. We pushed through the undergrowth and found it, a small cabin, hidden among the trees. Its wooden walls were weathered but intact, and the door hung slightly ajar. It looked abandoned at first glance, but something felt off. There were footprints in the dirt around the cabin, and the path leading to it had been recently cleared. My wife hesitated, urging us to leave it alone, but my curiosity got the better of me. "Let's just take a quick look," I said, gripping the handle of the door. The inside was surprisingly tidy. A cot with rumpled blankets sat in one corner, and a small table held a lantern and an assortment of tools. On the floor, there was a stack of newspapers, all from the past month, with articles circled in red pen. One of the headlines caught my eye: "Fugitive escapes custody, considered armed and dangerous." My stomach dropped as I realized that the man in the grainy photo matched the descriptions written in the margins of the paper. Someone had been living here, and they were clearly watching the news about themselves. We backed out of the cabin quickly, whispering about what to do next. My wife insisted we call the police immediately, but as I pulled out my phone, I noticed movement in the trees. A shadow, quick and deliberate, disappeared behind the cabin. "Get back to the truck," I said, keeping my voice low but firm. My kids didn't need to be told twice. My wife grabbed them and hurried down the overgrown path while I lingered, keeping an eye on the woods. As I turned to follow them, I heard a voice from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come here." It was low and menacing, the kind of voice that sends a chill straight down your spine. I didn't wait to see who it was. I sprinted back to the truck, heart pounding, and locked the doors as soon as we were inside. My wife was already on the phone with the sheriff, and we sped away, leaving the cabin and whoever was hiding there behind. The police arrived later that day with a full team to search the area. They found signs of recent activity, clothes, canned food, and a map of the surrounding farms, but the fugitive was gone. One officer told me it looked like the man had left in a hurry, possibly after realizing we had found his hideout. They assured us they'd patrol the area more frequently, but their words didn't erase the unease that had settled over our family. We haven't gone back to that lot since. The tools we left behind are probably still rusting there, tangled in the weeds. I catch myself looking toward the woods more often now, especially at dusk, wondering if he's still out there, watching. The land might belong to us on paper, but after that day, it felt like we were intruding on something darker, something that never wanted to be found. Living on a farm, you get used to quiet nights, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant howl of a coyote. But that night was different. I had just finished locking up the barn when I noticed something strange, faint, flickering lights coming from the forest that bordered the eastern edge of the property. At first, I thought it might be kids with flashlights or maybe hunters, but the way the lights danced and shifted didn't feel natural. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the woods. As I got closer, I turned off my light, not wanting to announce my presence. The air felt heavy, and the usual nighttime sound seemed muffled, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The lights grew brighter as I approached, casting an eerie glow through the trees. They weren't random flashes, they blinked in a pattern, almost like a signal. My pulse quickened as I crept closer, careful to stay hidden among the shadows. Finally, I reached a clearing. What I saw made my stomach drop. In the center of the open space, a group of men stood around a makeshift table illuminated by portable lanterns. Their faces were obscured by scarves and hoods, but their actions were clear. Stacks of cash and small, unmarked packages were being exchanged, their movements efficient and deliberate. It wasn't just a casual meeting, it was a full-blown operation. My first instinct was to back away, but as I shifted my weight, a branch snapped under my foot. The sound was deafening in the silence. Every head in the clearing snapped in my direction, their lanterns swinging toward the trees. My heart pounded as I ducked behind a fallen log, praying they hadn't seen me. "Who's there?" one of them barked, his voice sharp and commanding. I stayed as still as possible, holding my breath. After what felt like an eternity, one of them muttered, "It's probably an animal," and they went back to their business. But I knew I had to get out of there before they decided to check. I retraced my steps, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. The forest seemed darker than before, the trees pressing in around me. Just as I thought I was in the clear, I heard footsteps, heavy and deliberate, following me. I froze, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. A voice called out from behind, low and menacing, "We don't like spies." Panic surged through me, and I broke into a run, zigzagging through the trees in an attempt to lose them. When I finally burst out of the woods and into the open fields of my farm, I didn't stop until I was back inside the house, locking every door and window behind me. My hands shook as I called the sheriff, explaining what I'd seen. They promised to send someone to investigate, but I could tell they didn't believe me entirely. The next day, I noticed tire tracks leading away from the forest, as if the men had packed up and moved. The clearing was empty when the sheriff arrived, no table, no lanterns, no evidence. Since that night, I've been extra cautious around the woods. Every flicker of light in the distance makes my stomach churn. Whoever those men were, they knew the area well enough to set up right under my nose, and they were organized enough to vanish without a trace. I don't wander near the forest anymore. Sometimes, it's better not to know what's hiding in the darkness, because once you see it, there's no going back. Living in the countryside, you get used to knowing your neighbors, every detail of their lives, it seems. That's why old Mr. Harrington was such a mystery. He'd lived alone on his farm for as long as anyone could remember, keeping to himself and rarely venturing into town. My wife, Sarah, always said there was something odd about him, but I dismissed it as just eccentricity. That is, until we noticed the visitors. It started a few weeks ago. Late at night, headlights would cut through the darkness and disappear down the dirt road leading to Mr. Harrington's house. The cars didn't stick around for long, maybe 20 minutes at most, before speeding off into the night. It happened once, then twice, and soon it became a regular occurrence. Sarah couldn't let it go. "What kind of business could he possibly have at this hour?" she whispered one night, staring out the window. I couldn't answer. Our curiosity got the better of us. One particularly quiet evening, we decided to take a closer look. We parked our truck at the edge of the property and walked the rest of the way, keeping to the shadows. As we approached the house, we noticed faint light coming from the barn, a place that had looked abandoned for years. Inside, voices echoed, low and tense. Peeking through a crack in the wooden wall, we saw a group of men crowded around a table. Cash was being counted, and one of them held a suitcase, which another opened to reveal small, unmarked bags. My heart raced as I realized what we were seeing, some kind of drug deal. "We need to leave," I whispered, grabbing Sarah's arm. But she didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on something deeper in the barn. Following her gaze, I saw it, crates stacked in the corner, marked with the logo of a local fertilizer company. The crates weren't sealed, and sticking out of one were more of those unmarked bags. They weren't just dealing, they were using Harrington's farm to store and distribute their product. Before we could back away, the sound of gravel crunching behind us froze me in place. A man stepped out of the shadows, his hand resting on the holster of a gun. "You too lost?" he asked, his voice cold and calculating. I stammered something about looking for our dog, but he didn't buy it. "Funny place to lose a dog," he said, stepping closer. Inside the barn, the voices grew louder, and one of the men emerged to see what was happening. His face twisted in anger when he saw us. "Get them inside," he barked. We were dragged into the barn, our presence now painfully obvious to the group. Harrington sat in the corner, his face pale and drawn, avoiding our eyes. "They're just nosy neighbors," one of the men sneered, pulling out a knife and tossing it from hand to hand. "What do we do with them?" My stomach dropped as the room grew silent, the unspoken threat hanging heavy in the air. But before they could decide, the sound of sirens shattered the tension. The men scrambled, grabbing what they could and bolting out the back. Sarah and I stood frozen as officers swarmed the property. It turns out, someone in town had tipped off the police about suspicious activity at Harrington's farm. The raid was already planned, they just didn't expect to find two nosy neighbors in the middle of it. Harrington was arrested, though he claimed he had been threatened into letting the group use his land. The police later uncovered a network of illegal drug operations tied to the visitors we'd seen. Our quiet community was shaken, and so were we. Since that night, I've learned to keep my curiosity in check. Sometimes, knowing the truth comes with a price, and the shadows that fall over the countryside at night are best left undisturbed. Living on a rural property, you learn to value peace and privacy. My family and I worked hard to keep our farm running smoothly, and though we had our share of challenges, we'd never faced anything like that night. It started with distant gunshots echoing through the forest behind our home. At first, I dismissed it as regular hunting, this wasn't unusual for the area. But as the shots grew louder, I realized they were far too close to our property line. When I stepped onto the porch to check, I saw the flicker of flashlights weaving between the trees. My gut twisted. Whoever they were, they had crossed onto our land. I grabbed my shotgun, more as a precaution than anything else, and walked toward the edge of the field where the forest began. You're on private property. I called out, my voice firm but not aggressive. The flashlight stopped moving, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, a voice replied, low and mocking, we know. 3 men stepped out of the woods, their faces shadowed by hats and the dim moonlight. They were dressed in heavy hunting gear, each carrying a rifle slung over their shoulder. Just passing through, one of them said, his tone too casual. I repeated that they needed to leave, but the tallest of the group took a step closer. It's a big forest, he said, grinning. You don't own all of it. Something about the way he spoke sent a chill down my spine. By this time, my wife had come to the porch, holding a flashlight. Do we need to call the sheriff? She asked loudly, trying to sound braver than she felt. The tallest man chuckled. No need for that, he said. We're just here for sport. The way he emphasized the word sport made my blood run cold. I didn't want to escalate things, but their refusal to leave and their smug confidence made it clear this wasn't a misunderstanding. These men weren't just hunting animals, they were testing us. I told them one last time to leave, raising my shotgun slightly to make my point. They exchanged glances, as if deciding whether to comply. Finally, they backed into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. I stayed on edge for the rest of the night, patrolling the property while my wife and kids locked themselves inside. Just as I started to think they were gone for good, I heard something outside the barn. When I investigated, I found one of our cows dead, its throat slashed. The men had returned, and they were sending a message. My heart pounded as I ran back to the house, yelling for my wife to call the sheriff. Before I could reach the porch, a single gunshot rang out, the sound reverberating through the night. I hit the ground, searching for where it came from. In the distance, I saw the flash of a muzzle, followed by laughter. The sheriff arrived an hour later, but by then, the men were gone. He found tracks leading into the forest but admitted it would be hard to catch them without more evidence. This isn't the first time I've heard about these guys, he said. They like to scare folks, push boundaries. That was no comfort to us. We spent the next week on high alert, jumping at every noise, keeping the kids close, and locking up the house tightly each night. The men never returned, but the damage was done. Our sense of safety was shattered, and the woods that once felt like a part of home now seemed hostile. I still keep the shotgun by the door, and every so often, I catch myself staring at the tree line, waiting for the flash of a flashlight or the echo of a mocking laugh. In a place where peace used to reign, the memory of that night reminds me that not all predators walk on 4 legs. Farming is a tough job, but I've always been proud of the life I've built for my family. Part of that pride came from the equipment we worked so hard to afford, tractors, plows, and other machinery that kept the farm running smoothly. So, when one of my smaller machines disappeared, I was frustrated but chalked it up to bad luck. Maybe I'd left it somewhere I couldn't remember. But when a second machine went missing just days later, I knew it wasn't coincidence. Someone was stealing from us. I decided to keep watch. My wife wasn't thrilled about the idea, but I couldn't stand the thought of losing more equipment. I parked my truck near the barn, rifle across my lap, and waited. The first few nights were quiet, almost too quiet, and I started to wonder if I was wasting my time. But on the 4th night, just past midnight, I saw headlights cutting through the darkness. A truck rolled up near the far edge of the field, its lights off as it crept closer. My stomach churned, I wasn't alone. I watched as 3 men climbed out, their silhouettes barely visible against the moonlight. They moved quickly, heading straight for the shed where we kept our most expensive machinery. One of them carried bolt cutters, and another had what looked like a pistol tucked into his waistband. My heart pounded as I weighed my options. Confronting them alone was risky, but if I didn't act, they'd clean me out. I grabbed my rifle, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the truck. Hey! I shouted, my voice cutting through the still night air. The men froze, turning toward me. "This is private property. You'd better leave now." For a moment, no one moved. Then, the man with the bolt cutters laughed. "You think one guy with a gun is gonna stop us?" he sneered. He took a step forward, and I raised my rifle. "Try me," I said, keeping my hands steady even though my knees felt weak. The tension was suffocating, and for a moment, I thought they might back off. But instead of retreating, the man with the pistol drew his weapon. "You're making a mistake," he said, aiming it at me. My finger hovered over the trigger, ready to defend myself, when the sound of a second engine roared in the distance. The gang turned, distracted, as headlights flooded the area. It was my neighbor, Tom, who'd seen the suspicious truck from his property and come to help. He pulled up next to me, shotgun in hand, and the odds suddenly weren't in the thieves' favor anymore. The men panicked. One of them jumped back into their truck, while the others scrambled to grab what they could. Tom fired a warning shot into the air, and that was enough to send them running. They sped off, leaving behind the bolt cutters and a few smaller tools they had stolen. We called the sheriff immediately, and within an hour, the area was crawling with deputies. The stolen equipment wasn't just from my farm, it turned out the gang had been hitting properties all across the county. The sheriff said we were lucky. The gang was known to be dangerous, and if Tom hadn't shown up, the confrontation could have gone much worse. They were caught a few days later, thanks to the evidence left behind and witness reports. But the experience left a mark on me. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability, the thought that they might come back. Now, I've installed cameras and reinforced the locks on every shed and barn. I still keep the rifle close by, just in case. Farming is already hard enough without having to fight off criminals, but that night taught me something important. Sometimes, standing your ground is the only option, even when the odds seem stacked against you. In my small town, rumors travel fast. So when people started talking about strange lights coming from the old McAllister barn, everyone had an opinion. Some said it was haunted, others joked about alien activity. I didn't believe in ghosts or UFOs, but the idea of something unexplained in that creaky, abandoned barn intrigued me. One night, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check it out. Alone, of course, none of my friends wanted anything to do with it. It was just after midnight when I slipped out of the house, flashlight in hand. The walk to the barn was eerie. The wind cut through the empty fields, and the occasional rustle of leaves made me jump. When I got close, I turned off my flashlight to stay hidden and approached the barn cautiously. From the outside, it looked just as it always had, weathered and forgotten. But through the cracks in the wooden slats, I saw a faint, flickering light. I crouched low and crept closer, peering through a gap in the boards. What I saw made my stomach drop. Inside, the barn was far from abandoned. Bright lamps hung from the rafters, illuminating a maze of tables covered in chemical equipment. Jars, tubes, and containers of powder were neatly arranged, and the air was thick with a sharp, acrid smell. I'd seen enough crime shows to know what this was, a drug lab. But it wasn't just the setup that unnerved me, it was the two men working in the middle of it all. They moved methodically, checking the equipment and measuring substances. One of them was tall and wiry, his face partially obscured by a bandana. The other was stocky, with a scar running down his cheek. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language was intense, like they were on edge. My heart raced as I realized the danger of my situation. If they caught me, I doubted they'd just let me walk away. I tried to back away quietly, but my foot caught on a loose piece of wire. The sound was deafening in the silence. I froze, hoping they hadn't heard, but the men immediately stopped what they were doing. "Did you hear that?" one of them said, his voice sharp. The other grabbed a flashlight and started heading toward the door. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to find a hiding spot. I ducked behind an old tractor just as the barn door creaked open. The beam of the flashlight swept across the yard, coming dangerously close to where I was crouched. My breathing was shallow, and every muscle in my body screamed for me to run, but I stayed still. "Probably just an animal," the man muttered, but he didn't sound convinced. They lingered for a moment before heading back inside, locking the door behind them. I waited until their voices faded before making my escape, sprinting through the field as fast as I could. When I got home, I debated calling the police. What if they didn't believe me? What if the men found out I'd told someone? Eventually, I decided I couldn't ignore it. I made an anonymous call to the sheriff's office and described everything I'd seen. The next day, the police raided the barn. The lab was exactly as I described, and the two men were arrested trying to flee. The sheriff later told my parents that the operation was part of a larger drug ring. People in town talked about the raid for weeks, but I never told anyone I was the one who discovered it. To this day, I still get chills thinking about how close I came to being caught. That barn used to be just another forgotten relic of the past, but now, every time I pass it, I feel a knot in my stomach. It's a reminder that sometimes curiosity doesn't just uncover answers, it uncovers danger. Living on a farm, you learn to handle all kinds of challenges, but that storm was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The wind howled, rain lashed against the windows, and the power flickered on and off. I was sitting by the fire, listening to the creak of the old house, when a knock echoed through the noise. At first, I thought I imagined it. No one would be out in weather like that. But the knock came again, louder this time. Hesitant, I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. A man stood on the porch, drenched and shivering. He looked desperate, his eyes darting around nervously. "Please," he said, his voice trembling. "My car broke down. I need shelter just for tonight." Everything about him set off alarm bells in my head, his ragged clothes, the way he avoided looking me in the eye. But the storm was brutal, and I couldn't bring myself to turn him away. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. "You can dry off by the fire." He thanked me, though his gratitude felt forced. I offered him a towel and some coffee, and he sat down near the hearth, his hands shaking as he held the mug. We made small talk, but his answers were vague. He said he was traveling to see family but didn't elaborate. Something about his story didn't add up, but I didn't press. The storm made it easy to pretend everything was normal, even as unease gnawed at me. It wasn't until I stepped into the kitchen to grab more coffee that I saw it. The TV, which had been on a local news channel before the power went out, flickered back to life for a moment. The screen showed a mugshot, accompanied by the words, "Manhunt, suspect wanted for double homicide." My blood ran cold. It was him, the man sitting in my living room. I glanced back toward the fire, where he was hunched over, staring into the flames. He hadn't noticed the brief flash of the TV, and I quickly turned it off. My mind raced. What should I do? If I confronted him, it could end badly. But if I did nothing, I was sitting in a room with a murderer. I decided to act normal, keeping my tone steady as I returned to the living room. "You're welcome to stay in the guest room," I said, forcing a smile. He nodded, muttering a thanks, and I led him down the hall. Once he was out of sight, I grabbed my phone and stepped outside into the storm to call the police. The rain was deafening, and my signal was weak, but I managed to get through. The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way but warned me to stay calm and avoid alarming the suspect. I returned to the house, locking the door behind me. The man was still in the guest room, and I could hear him moving around. My hands trembled as I sat in the dark, waiting for the flashing lights of the patrol cars. When the police arrived, they surrounded the house quietly. I directed them to the guest room, where they found him trying to climb out the window. He was armed with a knife, but they subdued him quickly. As they led him away, he looked back at me, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and something else, disappointment, maybe, that I hadn't fallen for his act. The officers later told me that he'd been on the run for days, hiding wherever he could. I spent the rest of the night staring at the fire, unable to shake the image of him sitting there, pretending to be harmless. The storm passed by morning, but the feeling of dread lingered. I'd always believed my home was a place of safety, a sanctuary from the chaos of the world. That night shattered that illusion. Now, every knock at the door makes my heart race, and I can't help but wonder who might be waiting on the other side. Growing up on my family's farm, the wheat fields were always a source of comfort to me. They stretched endlessly, golden and peaceful, swaying in the wind like a sea of tranquility. But that night, the fields became something else entirely, a place of fear and horror that I'll never forget. It was late, and the house was quiet. I was lying in bed, almost asleep, when I heard it, a scream, sharp and chilling, cutting through the silence. At first, I thought it might have been an animal, but then I heard it again, human, terrified, and coming from the fields. I grabbed a flashlight and threw on my boots, my heart pounding as I stepped out into the cool night air. The sound had stopped, leaving an eerie stillness in its place. Every instinct told me to stay inside, to wake my parents or call someone, but curiosity and adrenaline pushed me forward. I followed the dirt path leading to the wheat fields, the beam of my flashlight bouncing off the tall stalks. The deeper I went, the more suffocating the darkness became, the walls of wheat closing in around me. About halfway through the field, I found something that made my blood run cold. The ground was disturbed, the stalks bent and broken in a wide circle. In the middle, there was blood, dark stains splattered across the dirt and the lower parts of the wheat. My flashlight shook as I scanned the area, and that's when I saw it, a torn piece of fabric, clinging to one of the stalks, fluttering slightly in the breeze. It was a vivid red, standing out starkly against the golden wheat. I froze, my breathing shallow. Whoever had screamed, something terrible had happened to them. My stomach churned as I crouched to inspect the ground more closely. There were drag marks leading away from the circle, disappearing deeper into the field. I wanted to run, to turn back and pretend I hadn't seen any of it, but I couldn't leave without knowing what had happened. Against my better judgment, I followed the trail. It ended at a small clearing near the edge of the field, where I found something even worse, a shallow grave, hastily covered with loose dirt. My legs felt like they might give out as I realized what I was looking at. Someone had been buried here. The ground was fresh, the earth still moist and uneven. I didn't dare dig any further. Instead, I turned and ran, sprinting back toward the house as fast as I could. The wheat seemed to grab at me, the stalks whispering in the wind, as if urging me to stop. When I reached the house, I locked the door behind me and called the police, my hands trembling so badly I could barely dial. They arrived within the hour, their flashing lights cutting through the night. I led them back to the spot, my heart pounding in my chest the entire way. As they uncovered the grave, I couldn't bring myself to look. The officers spoke in hushed tones, their faces grim, and one of them pulled me aside to ask if I'd seen anyone near the property that night. I hadn't. Whoever had done this was long gone. The investigation revealed that the victim was a young woman from a neighboring town, reported missing just days before. The police suspected it was the work of a drifter, someone who had passed through and taken advantage of the isolation of the farm. They never caught him. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wheat outside my window sent me into a panic. My once beloved fields now felt like a graveyard, their beauty tainted by what I'd found. Even now, I avoid the fields at night. The memory of that scream, the blood, and the grave still haunt me. The land that once felt safe and comforting now holds secrets I wish I'd never uncovered. Sometimes, I think I hear whispers in the wind when I pass by, as if the wheat remembers too. It started small, almost unnoticeable at first. A few chickens went missing, which I blamed on foxes. Then it was a goat, and I started double-checking the fences. But when one of my cows disappeared without a trace, I knew something wasn't right. The cow had been in a secured pen, and there were no broken gates or signs of predators. Just, gone. My wife tried to reassure me, saying it could have wandered off farther than we thought, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. A few days later, I found strange markings in the dirt near the edge of the woods that bordered our property. They looked like tracks, but not the kind you'd expect from a person or an animal. It was as if someone had dragged something heavy into the trees. That was when the fear really set in. Those woods were dense and untouched, a place even I rarely ventured into. But whatever had taken my animals had gone in there, and I needed to know what I was dealing with. One evening, after another chicken vanished, I decided to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle and headed toward the woods. The air was thick and heavy, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. As I pushed through the underbrush, I noticed something odd, symbols carved into the trees, crude and unfamiliar. My gut told me to turn back, but curiosity drove me forward. That's when I heard it, low, rhythmic chanting, faint but unmistakable, coming from deeper in the forest. The sound led me to a clearing I'd never seen before. At its center stood a stone altar, darkened with stains that glistened under the moonlight. Around it, a group of hooded figures stood in a circle, holding torches that cast eerie, flickering shadows. At their feet were the remains of my animals, arranged in grotesque patterns. My stomach churned as the realization hit me, this was no ordinary theft. This was a ritual. I must have made a noise, because the chanting stopped abruptly. The figures turned toward me, their faces hidden, and for a moment, we all stood frozen. Then one of them shouted, and the rest began moving toward me, their torches lighting up the trees as they closed in. My legs felt like lead, but fear took over, and I ran. The branches clawed at my skin as I sprinted back toward the safety of the fields, the sound of their footsteps echoing behind me. When I burst out of the woods and into the open, I didn't stop until I was inside the house, locking every door and window. My wife looked at me, her face pale as I told her what I'd seen. We called the sheriff, but by the time they arrived, the clearing was empty. The altar was gone, the torches extinguished, and all that remained were faint scorch marks on the ground. The officers took my statement but didn't seem convinced. Probably just kids messing around, one of them said, though his tone didn't match his words. Since that night, I haven't lost any more animals, but the unease lingers. The woods, once just another part of the farm, feel like forbidden territory now. I still find myself glancing toward the trees, especially at dusk, half expecting to see a flicker of torchlight or hear the faint sound of chanting. Whatever they were doing out there, I hope it's over. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that they're not done, and that they might come back. Farming is hard work, but it's honest, and I've always taken pride in it. Most mornings, I wake up before dawn, grab a cup of coffee, and head out to start the day. That morning started no differently, until it didn't. I had just stepped out of the barn, heading toward the tractor parked by the shed, when something caught my eye. A small, unfamiliar device was strapped to the undercarriage. At first, I thought it was some kind of maintenance tool I didn't remember installing, but as I got closer, the realization hit me like a punch to the gut, it was a bomb. I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely think. Wires protruded from a crudely assembled box, duct taped to the metal frame. I backed away slowly, hands shaking as I fumbled for my phone to call the sheriff. The dispatcher told me to keep my distance and wait for the bomb squad. The wait felt like hours, every second stretching into eternity as I stared at the thing that could have killed me if I'd turned the ignition. The bomb squad arrived in force, their vehicles kicking up dust as they pulled onto the property. They cordoned off the area and carefully approached the device. I watched from a safe distance with my wife, who had come running when she saw the commotion. "Who would do this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer, but my mind raced with possibilities. A disgruntled neighbor? A rival farmer? Or someone with a grudge I didn't even know about? After what felt like forever, one of the technicians confirmed that it was, indeed, a functioning bomb. They managed to disarm it safely and took it away for evidence. The sheriff pulled me aside afterward, his face grim. "This wasn't random," he said. "Whoever did this wanted to send a message." That didn't make me feel any better. If it wasn't random, it meant someone was targeting me specifically. But why? I'd always kept to myself, avoided trouble, and treated my neighbors fairly. In the days that followed, my anxiety grew. Every sound outside, every unfamiliar car passing the house, made my stomach churn. I started double-checking all the equipment before using it, searching for anything out of place. Then, one night, I heard footsteps outside. Grabbing my shotgun, I stepped onto the porch and saw a figure near the barn. They bolted when they saw me, disappearing into the darkness before I could get a good look. The next morning, I found a threatening note nailed to the barn door: "Stay off the south fields." The south fields bordered an area where some land disputes had been brewing for years. A developer wanted to buy up the surrounding farms, but I had always refused to sell. My land wasn't for sale, no matter how high the offer. It clicked. Someone was trying to intimidate me into giving up. I took the note to the sheriff, who agreed it was likely connected to the bomb. But proving who was behind it was another matter. The developer denied any involvement, of course, and without solid evidence, the case stalled. Since then, I've increased security around the farm: cameras, better locks, even a guard dog. The sheriff still patrols the area occasionally, but no arrests have been made. Whoever planted that bomb wanted me scared, and they succeeded. Every time I start a machine, I hesitate, checking and rechecking before turning the key. My farm, once a place of peace and pride, now feels like a battleground. I don't know if they'll try again, but one thing is certain: I won't back down. This land is my family's legacy, and I'll protect it with everything I've got. But every morning, as I walk toward the tractor, I can't help but wonder if today will be the day I find something worse waiting for me. Living out in the countryside, you get used to solitude. My family and I had always felt safe on our little piece of land, surrounded by fields and woods, far from the noise of the city. But that sense of security began to crumble one night when my wife noticed something unusual. "There's someone outside," she whispered, pulling me toward the window. I looked out into the darkness, but all I could see was the faint outline of trees swaying in the wind. "It's probably nothing," I said, trying to calm her, though my own unease was growing. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt near the back door. They were fresh, too large to be mine or my son's. They led around the house and disappeared into the woods. My heart sank as I realized someone had been circling our home while we slept. That night, I stayed up, watching from the living room window with the shotgun resting on my lap. Hours passed in silence, but just as I was beginning to nod off, I saw it, a figure moving through the shadows, just beyond the porch light. My stomach tightened as I watched the person creep closer, their movements slow and deliberate. I flicked on the porch light, and the figure darted back into the darkness. I rushed outside, shouting, "Who's there? Show yourself." But the night swallowed my words. All that remained was the sound of rustling leaves and my own heavy breathing. My wife begged me to call the police, but I hesitated. What could I tell them? That someone was walking around outside? Without more, I doubted they'd do much. The following evening, it happened again. This time, the figure stood still, just beyond the light's reach, staring at the house. It felt like they wanted us to see them, to know they were there. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped onto the porch, determined to confront whoever it was. "Get off my property!" I yelled, shining the beam toward the figure. That's when I saw the glint of metal in their hand, a gun. My blood ran cold as the intruder turned and disappeared into the woods. The next day, I called the sheriff, who promised to send someone to patrol the area. But that night, the stranger returned, bolder than before. They knocked on the windows, rattled the door handle, and left deep scratches on the wooden frame of the back door. My wife and son were terrified, and I felt helpless, unsure of how to protect them. When the police arrived, the stranger was gone, leaving behind only their haunting presence. The sheriff suggested it might be a drifter or someone looking to scare us off for some reason. But his calm demeanor didn't ease our fears. That night, I moved my family into the living room, locking every door and window, and stayed awake until dawn. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps on the porch. This time, I didn't hesitate. I swung the door open, shotgun in hand, and came face to face with the intruder, a man with a scruffy beard, wild eyes, and a revolver pointed at me. "Easy now," he said, his voice steady despite the situation. "I just need a place to stay." But the way he looked at me told a different story. He wasn't just looking for shelter, he was testing my limits. "Not here," I replied, my voice firm, though my hands were shaking. For what felt like an eternity, we stared each other down. Finally, he lowered the gun and backed away, disappearing into the woods once more. The sheriff found him 2 days later, squatting in an abandoned cabin miles from our farm. He had a record: assault, robbery, even attempted murder. Knowing how close my family had come to real danger still keeps me awake some nights. Our home, once a sanctuary, now feels like a place where shadows hold secrets. I still patrol the property every night, shotgun in hand, because I know that out here, help is a long way off, and we have to fend for ourselves. Farming has always been in my family. Every inch of our land holds memories, from harvest celebrations to long summer evenings under the open sky. But I never thought it would hold secrets, dark ones. It started on an ordinary morning. I was out in the far field, preparing a new plot for planting. The soil was rich and dark, perfect for crops, but as my shovel struck something hard, I knew it wasn't a rock. Digging further, I uncovered what looked like bone. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but as I cleared more dirt, the shape became unmistakable: a human skull. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the hollow eye sockets. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut: someone had been buried here. I dropped the shovel and backed away, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My wife, Sarah, came running when she saw me frozen in the field. When I showed her, her face turned pale. "We need to call the police," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The sheriff arrived with his team, and they cordoned off the area. Watching them dig felt surreal, like something out of a crime show. They uncovered more bones, neatly arranged, as if someone had taken care in burying the body. The sheriff pulled me aside and asked if I knew anything about the history of the land. I told him it had been in my family for generations, passed down from my grandfather. But I had no idea about this. No one ever mentioned a grave. As the investigation unfolded, the sheriff revealed that the remains belonged to a woman, likely buried decades ago. They couldn't identify her right away, but the forensic team found evidence of trauma, broken bones that suggested foul play. The thought that someone had been murdered and buried on my family's land made my skin crawl. Who was she? And more importantly, who had done this? Word spread quickly in our small town. People whispered about the discovery, speculating about the identity of the woman and pointing fingers at anyone who'd lived nearby back then. One of the older neighbors mentioned hearing rumors years ago about a drifter who had worked on the farm during my grandfather's time. "He disappeared suddenly," she said, her tone heavy with implication. Maybe he wasn't the one who left. The sheriff dug into old records and found reports of a missing woman from the 1970s, a migrant worker who had come through town during harvest season. Her description matched the skeletal remains. They questioned my father, who was just a boy at the time, but he remembered little, only that my grandfather had hired seasonal help from time to time. It was a dead end. One night, as I sat on the porch, staring out at the field, I couldn't shake the feeling that the land was different now. What once felt like a source of life now felt heavy, burdened by the weight of what had been uncovered. My wife tried to comfort me, saying it wasn't our fault, but the guilt lingered. Had my family unknowingly harbored a killer? Had we worked the soil above her grave for decades, oblivious to her presence? The case remains unsolved. The police removed the remains for further investigation, but no arrests were made. Sometimes, when I'm out in the field, I feel like I can still sense her there, a silent presence watching over the land where her life ended so abruptly. I've planted wildflowers in that spot, a small attempt to bring some peace to her memory. But the questions remain, haunting me every time I pick up the shovel: who was she, and why was her life taken so cruelly? It was supposed to be a routine delivery. The driver, Tom, was a trusted hand and had been hauling loads for our farm for years without a hitch. That morning, he left the barnyard with a full truck of freshly harvested corn, bound for a buyer in the next county. But by nightfall, Tom hadn't called to confirm the delivery. Calls to his phone went straight to voicemail, and my unease grew as the hours ticked by. Something was wrong. The next day, we reported the situation to the sheriff. A search began, with deputies scouring the roads along Tom's route. It wasn't until a hiker spotted a trail of tire tracks leading into the woods that things started to make sense. Following the tracks, the authorities found Tom's truck, empty, parked in a clearing like an abandoned shell. Of the driver or the cargo, there was no sign. The sight of the truck made my stomach drop. Someone had taken more than just our harvest, they had taken Tom too. The breakthrough came late that afternoon when the sheriff received a tip from a local who'd seen unusual activity near an old hunting cabin deep in the woods. A team was dispatched, and what they found was chilling. Tom was there, tied to a chair in the cabin, beaten but alive. His face was bruised, his hands and feet bound, and a gag had left deep marks around his mouth. When they freed him, he was disoriented but able to tell them what happened. According to Tom, he'd been forced off the road by another vehicle. 3 men, all masked, dragged him from the cab, tied him up, and tossed him into the back seat of their truck. They didn't say much, Tom recalled, his voice shaky as he recounted the ordeal. Just that they needed the corn and that I shouldn't make things harder than they had to be. After driving for what felt like hours, they dumped him at the cabin and left with the truck. The sheriff's investigation quickly pointed to a group of local criminals known for small-time thefts. They'd recently graduated to more serious crimes, targeting farms in the area. When the deputies raided a warehouse on the outskirts of town, they found most of the stolen corn, repackaged and ready to be sold. It was a relief to recover the cargo, but the thought of how close Tom had come to losing his life haunted all of us. In the days that followed, Tom struggled to shake off the experience. He couldn't bring himself to get behind the wheel of a truck again, and I couldn't blame him. For our family, the incident was a harsh reminder of how vulnerable we were, even in a small, tight-knit community. I installed cameras around the property and hired extra hands to help with transport, but the sense of security we'd once taken for granted was gone. The criminals were eventually caught and sentenced, but the scars they left on our farm and on Tom remained. Every time I see a truck pull out of the barnyard, I think about that night, the silence, the fear, and the way it all could have ended so much worse. Farming is hard enough without having to worry about the shadows that linger on the edge of the fields, but now, I know better. Sometimes, the biggest dangers aren't in the work you do, they're in the people watching, waiting to take what isn't theirs. Our farm had always been secure, or so I thought. The fences that surrounded the property were strong, checked regularly to keep the livestock safe and predators out. That's why, when I found a gaping hole in the north fence one morning, I was stunned. The wood wasn't rotting, and the break wasn't from natural wear. It looked deliberate, planks had been cut cleanly and pulled aside. My first thought was that someone was trying to steal livestock, but as I looked closer, the tracks near the opening told a different story. There were tire marks pressed deep into the dirt, along with boot prints. They led into a secluded section of the farm near the edge of the woods, where the land was rarely used. My stomach churned as I followed the trail, which led to a small clearing hidden from view by tall trees. There, the ground was littered with cigarette butts, empty bottles, and scraps of plastic. It was clear this wasn't just a random break-in, someone had been using my land as a meeting spot. That night, I decided to keep watch. I parked my truck a short distance away, where I could see the clearing without being noticed. The hours crawled by, and I was beginning to think it was a fluke, just a bunch of kids messing around. But just after midnight, I saw headlights cutting through the darkness. A car crept through the broken section of the fence and parked in the clearing. Moments later, another car arrived, its occupant stepping out and shaking hands with the first group. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their movements were deliberate, their demeanor tense. They exchanged items, small packages for wads of cash. My pulse quickened as I realized what I was witnessing. This wasn't just trespassing, it was a full-blown drug deal. My farm had become their cover, a remote and quiet place far from prying eyes. I stayed hidden, too scared to confront them, but I took photos with my phone as evidence. My hands were shaking, but I knew I needed something solid to show the sheriff. When the men finally left, I called the authorities and showed them the photos. The sheriff took me seriously, sending deputies to inspect the site the next day. They found traces of narcotics in the discarded items and confirmed my suspicion. "This isn't the first report of something like this," the sheriff said. "They've been moving through rural properties to avoid getting caught in town." He assured me they'd increase patrols, but the damage was already done. Knowing strangers had been sneaking onto my land at night left me uneasy. In the following weeks, I reinforced the fence and installed motion detection lights and cameras around the property. I didn't want to take any chances. A few nights later, one of the cameras caught a figure approaching the fence, but the bright floodlight scared them off. I never saw the cars return, but the memory of that night lingers. The clearing, once just another quiet part of the farm, now feels like a place where danger once loomed. Every time I check the fence, I think about how easily they used my land without a second thought, turning my home into a site for their crimes. The thought still makes my blood boil. I can only hope that the measures I've taken will keep them away for good. But the sense of safety I once had on this farm, that's gone, and I'm not sure it's ever coming back. Running a farm means long hours and constant vigilance, but I've always found a sense of peace in the routine. That peace shattered one night when I heard noises coming from the grain silo. It was late, and everyone else was asleep. At first, I thought it might be a raccoon or some other animal that had found its way inside. But the sounds were too deliberate, metal clanking, footsteps echoing faintly. My gut told me it wasn't an animal. Grabbing my flashlight and the old shotgun I kept near the back door, I stepped out into the cool night air. The silo stood tall and dark against the moonlit sky, its looming shape now tinged with unease. As I approached, the noises grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like someone was moving equipment, shuffling sacks of grain. My heart raced as I tried to piece together what was happening. Who would be out here in the middle of the night? I circled the silo, keeping to the shadows, and noticed that the small service door on the side had been pried open. My stomach tightened as I realized this wasn't just a random intrusion, someone had broken in with a purpose. Peering inside, I saw the faint glow of a flashlight beam moving along the walls. Then I saw him, a man, dressed in dark clothing, loading sacks of grain onto a makeshift pulley system. He was stealing from me, right under my nose. "Hey!" I shouted, stepping into the doorway and raising the shotgun. The man froze, his flashlight dropping to the ground and rolling to a stop. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I demanded, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. He didn't answer right away, just raised his hands slowly, his face partially hidden by a scarf. I needed the grain," he said finally, his voice trembling. "Please, don't shoot." I kept the shotgun trained on him as I called the sheriff, giving a brief description of the situation. The man tried to explain himself, claiming he was desperate, but his story didn't add up. When the sheriff arrived, they searched him and found tools for breaking into silos and a map marking other farms in the area. It turned out he wasn't working alone, he was part of a group targeting rural properties for grain theft, reselling the stolen goods for quick cash. The man was arrested, and the sheriff assured me they'd investigate the rest of the operation. But the incident left me shaken. The thought of someone sneaking onto my property, planning and executing a theft in the dead of night, made me realize how vulnerable we were. I installed better locks on the silo and added motion-activated cameras around the farm, but the sense of safety I once felt was gone. Since that night, I've been more cautious. Every creak of the barn, every rustle in the wind puts me on edge. Farming is hard enough without having to worry about people looking to take what you've worked so hard to build. The silo still stands as a reminder of that night, and every time I pass it, I think about the man inside, and how close I came to not catching him in time. Out here, far from the city, you expect peace, but sometimes, the shadows hide more than just animals. It was a typical morning on the farm, the kind where you're up before the sun, checking the animals and planning out the day. But my routine came to a halt when I noticed a missed call on my phone. It was from Miguel, one of my workers. He was reliable and rarely called, so seeing his name made me pause. I hit play on the voicemail, expecting something about a broken piece of equipment or a sick animal. Instead, his voice came through, shaky and panicked. "You need to check the barn. Something bad happened. I'm sorry, I have to go." The message sent a chill down my spine. Miguel didn't say what he meant, and he wasn't answering his phone. I grabbed my jacket and headed straight for the barn. As I approached, I noticed something was off. The door, which was usually secured, was slightly ajar, swinging in the breeze. My heart raced as I pushed it open, the familiar smell of hay and animals now tinged with something metallic, blood. Inside, the barn was eerily quiet, save for the faint rustling of the animals. Near the far corner, I saw it, a dark stain spreading across the ground, pooling beneath a tarp. My stomach turned as I stepped closer, pulling back the cover. Beneath it was a man I didn't recognize, his lifeless body sprawled across the dirt. His clothes were torn, and there were clear signs of a struggle, scratches on his arms and bruises on his face. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't an accident. I called the sheriff immediately, my hands trembling as I described what I'd found. The deputies arrived within the hour, taping off the area and combing the barn for evidence. Miguel still hadn't returned my calls, and the sheriff wanted to know why. "Do you think he was involved?" one of the deputies asked. I didn't know what to say. Miguel had worked for me for years, he was trustworthy. But his voicemail and sudden disappearance painted a troubling picture. As the investigation unfolded, the pieces began to fall into place. The victim was a known thief, part of a local gang that had been targeting farms in the area. The sheriff speculated that he'd broken into the barn late at night, likely looking to steal tools or supplies. But what he didn't count on was running into someone, Miguel. A scuffle must have ensued, and things spiraled out of control. It was self-defense, the sheriff said, but Miguel's disappearance made it look suspicious. A few days later, Miguel finally called. His voice was filled with guilt and fear as he explained what happened. He had caught the man in the act and confronted him. The thief pulled a knife, and in the struggle, Miguel hit him with a nearby tool to defend himself. When he realized the man was dead, he panicked and fled. "I didn't mean to kill him," he said, his voice breaking. I didn't know what to do." The sheriff assured Miguel that it was self-defense and urged him to turn himself in, which he did. Though it took time for the dust to settle, the truth eventually came out, clearing Miguel's name. But the whole ordeal left a scar on our farm. The barn, once a place of work and life, now felt like a crime scene. Every time I stepped inside, I couldn't shake the image of the body under the tarp or the sound of Miguel's panicked voicemail. Farming has its challenges, but this was something I never imagined facing. It reminded me that even in the quietest corners of the countryside, darkness can find its way in. I've tightened security since then, new locks, cameras, the works. But there's no erasing the memory of that night or the lesson it taught me: you can never be too careful, even in a place you've always called home. The annual rural fair was the highlight of our small farming community. Farmers from miles around brought their best crops, livestock, and machinery to show off and trade. This year, the buzz was bigger than ever. The fairground was packed with gleaming tractors, combines, and every piece of state-of-the-art equipment you could imagine. For someone like me, who'd spent years scraping by with older machinery, it was a dream to see these machines up close. But what none of us realized was that the fair was about to become the site of a well-orchestrated theft. The first sign of trouble came late on the second night. I was walking back to my truck after closing up my stall when I overheard a commotion near the machinery exhibit. One of the exhibitors was shouting at the fair organizers, claiming his new tractor, worth more than some houses, was missing. At first, people assumed he'd parked it somewhere else or loaned it out without remembering. But by morning, the problem had grown. 2 more machines were missing, and no one had any idea how they'd been taken. The organizers called the police, and an investigation began. Security at the fair was decent, but not foolproof. Cameras were set up at the entrances, but the footage showed nothing unusual. Whoever had taken the machines had avoided the main gates entirely. The fairgrounds were surrounded by fields and service roads, making it easy for someone to slip in unnoticed. People started whispering about an inside job. The idea that someone working at the fair could be involved was hard to stomach, but it was the only explanation that made sense. As the investigation dragged on, tensions rose. Farmers began locking up their booths earlier, and security patrols doubled. That's when I noticed something strange. A group of temporary workers hired to help with setup and cleanup seemed unusually interested in the machinery. They lingered around the exhibits, asking detailed questions about the equipment and its features. At first, I chalked it up to curiosity. Many of them weren't farmers, so it made sense they'd be intrigued. But one of them, a wiry man with a nervous demeanor, kept glancing over his shoulder, as if he was waiting for someone. I decided to keep an eye on them, and it didn't take long for my suspicions to grow. Late one evening, I saw the same man near the back of the fairgrounds, talking on his phone in hushed tones. Nearby, a utility truck was parked with its lights off, barely visible in the dark. I watched as another worker joined him, and they began loading small but expensive equipment into the truck. My heart raced as I realized I was witnessing the theft in action. Quietly, I called the sheriff and reported what I'd seen. Within minutes, deputies arrived and caught the men in the act. The investigation that followed uncovered a larger scheme than any of us had imagined. The temporary workers were part of a network that targeted rural fairs, using their positions to scope out valuable equipment and plan the heists. They avoided cameras, coordinated their movements with precision, and had buyers lined up to take the stolen goods almost immediately. The recovery effort took weeks, but most of the stolen machinery was found, including the missing tractor. The fair organizers implemented stricter security measures, and the hiring process for workers became much more rigorous. The incident left a bitter taste in the mouths of many farmers, myself included. The fair, which had always been a place of trust and community, now felt tainted by the betrayal of those who used it as an opportunity for crime. I still attend the fair every year, but I can't help but keep a wary eye on everyone around me. The memory of that night, watching those men load stolen equipment into a truck, stays with me. It's a reminder that even in a close-knit community, you can't always trust the people standing next to you. And sometimes, the biggest threats come from the ones who blend in the best.